Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA. I don't want to sound like a radio announcer of some sort or an advertising jingle, whatever. But anyway, welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to this show. If it is the first time you're joining in, thank you. Really appreciate you joining in. The purpose of the show is twofold. One is for technical operators. If you're a database administrator, systems engineer, or sometimes you just happen to be an analyst who knows how to spell SQL. Apparently that's a very easy thing to do nowadays. You ask ChatGPT what it is and it gives you a ton of information that sometimes isn't even relevant. And part of your responsibility is dealing with managing, fixing issues, troubleshooting, high availability and or disaster recovery solutions for your SQL Server databases. Then this is for you. Although majority of the things that I cover here is on always-on availability groups, mainly because Microsoft has been pushing and is still pushing, even in the public cloud infrastructure. They've been pushing always-on availability groups as if it is the only high availability and or disaster recovery solution available, even if you don't need it. Again, the purpose of this show for technical operators, I share tips, tricks, lessons learned, mistakes that I've made. I'm not shy about those because I've learned from them. Mistakes made, case studies, customer, I don't want to say horror stories, success stories even. Customer cases, of course, I don't specifically mention the customer's name for NDA purposes, so that you can be confident, more than confident, to do your day-to-day responsibilities, managing SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. But I did say it's twofold, right? The second one is for decision makers, whether you're a CIO, CTO, team lead, the manager of the information technology team, and you're either evaluating the solution or you already have a solution, somebody built it for you, but then your team is not ready, or you need to do an entire assessment of your environment, just getting a second pair of eyes and making sure that it is highly available. Well, this is for you. For the past month, and what I try to do is I wanted to keep things easy for me. I'm lazy, but part of that is I wanted to make it easy for me to come up with these topics. For one, I really appreciate if you've been watching for quite a while and you've been making suggestions, comments, sometimes DMs or email for topics and questions. They become the basis of the topics that I cover in these episodes, and I really appreciate that. But of course, there's only so much question that I could think of, or so much question that you would submit, or comments that you make. I want to ask ChatGPT, because the other day I did ask ChatGPT, hey, what's the most common problem that most database administrators face? And sometimes it's just giving it, it's hallucinating. That's kind of like the word for LLMs nowadays. It's hallucinating and it's spitting out information that is somehow relevant, but then when you really dig into like the responses, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And so what I did was I came up with like monthly theme, so topic theme for every month, so that I would focus on that theme, and then based on the questions that you submit, your comments that you submit, I will categorize those according to the month's theme, and then that's going to be the basis of the topics that I'm going to be covering. This month's topic is all about design, and when I say design, I'm referring to top to bottom, end to end, high availability solution and disaster recovery included, making the design and focusing more on the design aspect. If you're an operator, of course, that's probably not something that you do. Sometimes that would be relegated to somebody who's more senior or they would outsource, your boss might outsource that to a managed services provider, a consulting company, an independent consultant, or anybody else. Maybe your former senior DBA who left, brought him in, designed the solution, the infrastructure, and that's what I wanted to focus on the entire month, because in the past, more than a decade now working with always-on availability groups, and almost 2+ decades working with high availability and disaster recovery in general, I've seen so many cases where a problem, an issue, even an outage could have been prevented if the system and the solution was designed properly. Okay, and this is what I wanted to focus on for the entire month. And this episode focuses on simplicity. Okay, the ultimate high availability and disaster recovery strategy. And I kind of refer to that as the ultimate high availability and disaster recovery strategy, because there are so many things. Okay, there are so many complications, complexities that come into the picture when you're building a high availability and or disaster recovery solution. Even more so when you're managing it, you're administering it, you're part of doing day-to-day operation, and you have no clue about how it was designed, why it was designed like that. I remember one of the very first cases that I worked on back in this was 2014. One of the very first cases that I worked on involved a customer who reached out, and they were having outages after outages. And we had a call. I started looking at their infrastructure. Lo and behold, the very reason why they keep getting outages after outages was because of the design. The design was, it was a 2-node Windows Server failover cluster with 2 replica availability groups stretched across different data centers. Ugh. And so we ripped that apart, even though it's already in production, and they could have prevented all of those outages causing production disruption in their production operation if only they designed it properly. Okay, that's why I'm huge on keeping things simple, right? Keeping things simple. This is the ultimate high availability. For me, this is the ultimate high availability and or disaster recovery strategy. Okay, and I want to start this off with a quote from I want to say, as a musician, I used to play bass, and Charles Mingus was one of my favorite bass players, and I got this quote. In fact, this quote, I used this quote a couple of years back when I was doing a presentation on presentations, like creating designs. It says, making the simple complicated is commonplace. Making the complicated simple. Awesomely simple to a point where you can no longer simplify it. That's creativity. Okay, we have become conditioned, especially in technology, engineering. I come from that background, engineering, computer science, information technology, where we make something so complicated that we forget the goal is not to complicate things, but to simplify things. But it really does require a lot of thinking, a lot of iterating for you to come up with a very simple design. That's why I said this episode is all about simplifying things, making sure that your design is as simple as you possibly can. And why is this the ultimate, I consider, high availability and disaster recovery strategy? Like I said, I've seen so many cases where the design in and of itself, if done properly, could have prevented the issue from happening in the first place. And I'm a big believer of prevention rather than cure. Big believer of that. But unfortunately, though, sometimes we don't want to be proactive. We just respond and we become reactive. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why you could have prevented, or customers could have prevented issues from happening in the first place if they focused on the design aspect. But unfortunately, though, again, in many cases, somebody else built it, and the operations team is now tasked with taking care of something that they didn't even design, or have no idea how the design was done. They're clueless. Okay, let's start off with what I call the complexity death spiral. Okay, what is the complexity death spiral? Think of it as the complexity of the complexity of the complexity, where you're, well, let's start off with a premise that high availability and disaster recovery in and of itself is already complex. Okay? It is already complex. Let's use SQL Server as of course, we're talking about SQL Server. Let's use SQL Server standalone instance as an example. Simple backup and backup restore. Even configuring backups of your databases is already complex, meaning you're doing a combination of full, differential, sometimes file group, depending on the size of your database, transaction log backup, and scheduling that so that it meets your recovery point and recovery time objective. And then you're going to add high availability on top of that. So when you start introducing a lot of these other components to achieve high availability, it becomes overly complex. That's why I call it the complexity death spiral. Okay, so let's elevate your standalone instance to an always-on availability group. Now you have to think about failover clustering to achieve high availability. With failover clustering comes, you have to worry about quorum, you have to worry about networking, you have to worry about communication between nodes in your failover cluster. You have to worry about witness, whatever that type of witness is. You have to worry about stuff like DNS, Active Directory. All of these things are outside of SQL Server. And more often than not, and this is something that a lot of my friends from Microsoft customer support, is that whenever they're getting a customer open a case with Microsoft and they tag it as always on availability groups, more often than not, and this was more than a decade ago, up until like a couple of years ago, there's a pattern. Between 60 to 80% of the cases being opened, tagged always on availability groups, has nothing to do with SQL Server. And so now you're looking at different components that add complexity to the mix just for you to achieve high availability. Not to mention, of course, your existing strategy for DR, like backups. So it becomes more fragile because there's so many potential components that could break. Okay, the more you introduce complexity, the more there are potential points of failure that could happen. One of the reasons why the idea behind failover clustering exists is because you want to prevent single points of failure. That's also one of the reasons why your hardware is fully redundant. You have hot swappable CPU, hot swappable memory, hot swappable hard drives, hot swappable power sources or power supplies, hot swappable network adapters. All of these, of course, you don't get to see this if everything's in public cloud infrastructures or virtualized. It is challenging to see this, but the hardware is in and of itself designed. Why? Because you're trying to prevent single points of failure. But the more complex your architecture is, the more you're introducing components that could potentially fail, which means you now have to think about how you make those components highly redundant. Okay, so it's not just the Windows Server failover cluster, it's not just the hardware that a failover cluster runs, but also the other external components that could potentially cause issues and outages in the complexity of your architecture. Okay, the next one is what I call the allure of over-engineering. Okay, the allure of over-engineering, and this is something that a lot of customers have, not because they want it to be that way, but because the solution either evolved throughout the years that they've stacked complexity and over-engineered something. Okay, so the first part is the complexity death spiral. This with the allure of over-engineering. Again, either the solution has evolved over years, or if it's a brand new solution, whether that's the engineering team building the solution, the consultant, or the DBA team, or the CIO, they fall into this trap of, let's implement this, not realizing that it may or may not be what they needed. Okay, I started off this episode with a quote or a phrase that says, Microsoft is recommending always-on availability groups, even though it may or may not be the right solution for you. Okay, and that's a temptation. Your CIO may have heard it from a conference they've attended, maybe Microsoft Ignite, and they've heard of course, nowadays they don't talk about always-on availability groups anymore. Everybody's talking about Fabric. But they've heard somebody mention always-on availability group. You get charged with deploying it without even asking whether or not it's the right solution for you. Okay? In some cases, and this is something that I've also seen, in some cases, either the consultant built it and they want to put it on their resume. Hey, I built a 24-node Windows Server failover cluster with, of course, not all nodes or replicas in a single AG. We built a 24-node Windows Server failover cluster with 25 availability groups. Then I remember one case. This was a couple of years ago. I didn't work on the case, but then somebody approached me after a presentation that I did on failover clustering, and they asked me, there were a team of engineers, they asked me, so we are upgrading this 27-node Windows Server failover cluster. And the first question I asked was, why do you have a 27-node Windows Server failover cluster? They couldn't answer the question. Okay? Because that in and of itself is probably over-engineered for their need. And again, it might be a consultant who decided, hey, I want to put this in my resume. And so I'm going to build the most complex, the most convoluted solution that only I know, so that in my next job I can talk about it and I can tell everybody, hey, I did this for this company. Okay. My approach to this is to only build the minimum, and I say minimum, the minimum required infrastructure and solution for your specific business needs. That's why I always go back to what's a recovery point, recovery time objective, and service level agreement. Because you do not want to be over engineering for something that you don't need. I kind of liken this to when you're driving a car and you're looking at your speedometer and you see 220 kilometers per hour or 190 kilometers per hour, and you kind of wonder, why did they build the car to run or to drive at that speed when you can't even drive that fast on normal city driving, let alone in freeways or highways? That's kind of like over-engineering, the way I look at it. But again, it is very tempting to fall into the trap of over-engineering for over-engineering's sake. And it becomes kind of like the complexity death spiral. You're introducing more points of failure, okay, into the mix the more you're over-engineering existing solution, to a point where you kind of ask the question, what's your recovery time objective? If your recovery time objective is in like 1 hour, 2 hours, and you're okay with that, maybe a backup copy restore would be more than enough. So long as, of course, you've tested your DR strategy and you were able to validate whether or not your existing solution actually meets those needs. Okay. The third one is what I call feature stacking. Okay. What is feature stacking? So feature stacking, I kind of hinted on this idea in the first point, complexity, that's spiral, where you already have something that's existing in your building on top of it. A typical example that I use here is, sure, you started off with a standalone instance, you already have full database backups, probably a combination of full and differential plus transaction log backup. So you now have per database, I'm talking about per database here, you have a full database backup, differential backup, and transaction log backups. How does that look like when you restore that? Because the more complex your backup strategy is, the more complex your restore strategy is, and of course the longer it will take. Okay, that's also one of the reasons why you're combining full with differential depending on the size of the database, and a combination of transaction log backups. Imagine adding always on available group on top of that. So now you have to worry about your existing backup solutions with always on available groups. But I'm trying to simplify here, because I had a customer from way back 2015. They're a regulated industry, and initially they had a standalone SQL Server instance, and they had TDE, transparent data encryption, and they had file stream enabled for their databases, or majority of their databases. So they had a file stream enabled for their databases, the entire SQL Server instance that is, and TDE. Now they wanted to have always on availability groups. So imagine this, you have encryption happening. You have file stream. So now you have to think about all of these things as part of your implementation. Meaning you have to make sure that every single node in your failover cluster and every single replica in your availability group would have, number one, TDE enabled. Okay. Number two, you would have to have a file stream enabled on all of your replicas. Not only that, you now have to rehearse your HA NDR strategy to make sure that they still meet your recovery point and recovery time objectives. I remember one customer from, this was after this specific case, where they already have an existing always on available group. They turn on TDE, and they were wondering why the database is not synchronizing. Well, of course, you have to turn it on every single node in your failover cluster, as well as every single replica in your always on availability group. They were wondering why the databases are not getting replicated. Well, it is getting replicated, it's just that it's not getting synchronized because it could not run a redo on the secondary replica until you've configured your secondary replica with TDE as well. Okay, so yeah, your feature stacking, because it is more than just your HA solution. What about doing snapshots? Okay, this customer that I had from, this was 2014 as well, big transportation company, and they had an existing VMware HA solution with a third-party VM backup solution, and the traditional database backups, and then they implemented always on availability groups. Think about that for a second. You have your VMware HA, you have your traditional backups, database backups, you have a third-party VM backup solution, and now you're adding in high availability for your databases, for your always on availability groups. Imagine, and we started off with a complexity death spiral. Imagine how complex that is. Okay, and then over engineering. You already have the backups, you already have the VMware HA, you already have third-party VM snapshot utility, and now you're adding always on available groups. So now when it comes to troubleshooting issues, it becomes really complex. So the troubleshooting becomes even more, it takes longer. Issue resolution takes longer as well, because they're simply stacking features on top of features on top of features. Oh, by the way, we haven't even talked about log shipping there. they were using that database instance as a backend for a SharePoint farm, and which happens to be reason they reached out to me was every 8 p.m. their entire SharePoint farm would go offline. Every 8 p.m. I see a pattern. What's happening every 8 p.m.? Turns out that they were doing VM snapshots. Yes, they were doing VM snapshots to a point where the snapshot was taking longer than the configured heartbeat setting on a failover cluster, thereby taking the entire failover cluster offline, which in turn will turn the availability group offline, take it offline, which will, the side effect of it, the entire SharePoint farm goes offline. Made sense to me, but not for them because they have different teams working on these different features. They're stacking on top of the other existing features, which leads me to what I call the people aspect. So far we've talked about the death spiral, the complexity death spiral, the allure, the temptation of over-engineering, and then the stacking of existing HA and DR features. But what about the people? Because here's the thing, complexity leads to confusion. And this is one of those things, like that example right there. They have VMware HA, their VM admins designed an HA solution for their entire infrastructure. Kind of like, we're going to put all of these VMs here, and they're all going to be highly available. And then their backup admins work with their VM admins to come up with a VM snapshot solution using a third-party solution. So that's fine. But then they're not talking to their database administrators who would have their own database backups, your differential, your transaction log backups, plus always-on availability groups. So now it's the VM admin taking care of VM HA, high availability, right? The backup team will take care of doing VM snapshots, or that could be the enterprise backup team. The network team will also have to be brought in to make sure that they tweak the network settings for quality of service, for bandwidth, so that the VMs will take as quick snapshots, that is, will take as short time as possible that would not interfere with heartbeat settings. But because, again, they're not coordinating with each other, VM snapshot, or the team responsible for the VM snapshot, is not aware that there's a failover cluster running on these VMs, that a VM snapshot taking longer than the heartbeat settings will take an entire availability group online, not to mention the SharePoint that uses the databases. Okay, so all of these things, because people are part of this, even if you automate everything, even if you automate the entire feature stack that I talked about, even if you automate all of these things. In fact, the latest Azure and AWS outages rather, they automated updating DNS entries or DNS settings or whatever. They automated it. They're at this scale, they're huge, so they had to automate it. Even if you automate it, because there's so many people involved, okay, so many technologies, so many features involved, there's so many people involved as well. And you want to design a system where if you've got woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're not scrambling around trying to read runbook after runbook after runbook after runbook, because that would add more to the time that you should be putting into resolving an outage. And so the simple something is, the easier it is to communicate. Especially, again, we started off with the premise that high availability and disaster recovery solutions are by nature already complex. Let's not add more to the complexity. And so you want to make sure that if an outage happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're in bed, you got woken up. Again, if you're an operator, you got woken up, maybe your frontline operations team opened a ticket, escalated to you, called you 3 o'clock in the morning. You want to make sure that the minute you got out of bed, you're not scrambling. Because again, you have to design for that. You have to design your infrastructure, your solution for that 3 o'clock in the morning where somebody who knows this solution has not had coffee, has not had sleep, proper sleep, because again, 3 o'clock in the morning, how many hours of sleep have you had? You have to design for that situation. Also, designing for the situation where the most senior guy who built this thing is not available. Maybe he went on vacation. And so you have to design your solution, you simplify it to a point where the most junior guy, and of course we don't expect the most junior guy to be the only person available. That's also one of the reasons why you have to staff properly. Your people, the staff, your teammates, they have to be the ones to support this and resolve issues when it happens at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the more complex it is, the more confused they become. Okay? As for that example, the database administrators, or it wasn't even the database administrators, it was the SharePoint administrators reporting that their entire SharePoint farm goes offline at 8 p.m. So what does that have to do with, feature stacking? Well, the fact that it was the SharePoint team who felt the pain of the outage caused by somebody who decided we want to take snapshots of this. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that, again, the more complex something is, the more there is that tendency to drop the ball on communicating with the different teams. And then even if you make changes to the infrastructure, you drop the ball on communicating it with different teams involved in that solution, even if they were not even part of building that solution. Okay? That is why this is really, really, really important. And which kind of brings me back to like simplifying things. And this is, again, something that I tell my customers all the time. Is this something that you need? Okay, if they already have it, sure. If they're in the process of designing the high availability or disaster recovery solution, I guide them through the process of asking these questions so that they don't just jump in and implement more complex one. Right? One of the projects that I'm currently working on right now is they wanted to build an always-on available group with Azure Managed Instance Link, and my question was, why? Oh, because we want to move to the cloud. Sure. Are you 100% sure? Okay. And these are the things that I have to ask because sometimes, again, they read that the feature was there. They want to try it. Your goal is not to implement every new feature that Microsoft introduces. Your goal is to provide solution that would meet the business need. And if that happens to be, in that case, always on availability group, then so be it. Okay. So be it. If it isn't, then probably not worth the effort of doing the whole exercise. Okay? And so this is something, again, this is something that you have to kind of consciously condition yourself to, I don't want to say avoid over engineering, it's just consciously make that decision to not over engineer. Keep things simple because it is in our nature. It's just us being humans to complicate things because we want to solve problems. It's just natural for us to solve problems, and so we want to complicate things because what's the point of having a simple solution if we're not going to be solving any problem, right? But the point of having a high availability and or disaster recovery solution is to make sure that you prevent outages and issues from happening as possible. As much as possible, that is. Okay, that is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA, the R show. And like I said, I'm going to be focusing for this one. I'm going to be focusing more on design. What are the different aspects of the design? Who needs to be a part of building the solution? All that, because again, there are issues that could have been prevented if the design was done properly. And in some cases, maybe you cannot redesign things, but the goal is for you to practice being intentional about simplifying things. Like simplify things. Maybe you cannot change your architecture. Maybe you are restricted from making modifications to your solution, especially in highly regulated industries where this is what was approved, this is what we submitted so that we can pass regulatory requirements and you can make modifications. How can you simplify not just the design, because you can't touch that anymore? How can you simplify your processes? How can you simplify like the workflow that you're doing in order to keep your databases up and running 24/7 as much as you possibly can, right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Again, tune in for the next episode. And if you do need help with anything high availability and or disaster recovery with your SQL Server databases, use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session and I'll be happy to help in any way I can. That link will send you through my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Now, I call them strategy sessions because we're going to be doing two things. One, we're going to get clear on what the real issue is. Sometimes it's a design problem that we need to address. If we can't make modifications on the design, we'll find ways and how to work around it. Okay? And that's the first part, being clear on what the real issue is, not the superficial issues. Okay? And once we've identified what the real issue is, we are going to be coming up with a strategy that would help you address those issues, improve your processes, even help your team make sure that they're well equipped to manage the infrastructure. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have a conversation. If I can help, I'm more than happy to. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help serve you best. Again, grab that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and looking forward to having that conversation with you. All right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Highly recommend that you go through some of the past episodes. If you're watching this on YouTube, just go and scroll through some of the past episodes. If you're on LinkedIn, it might take a while because I've got other posts on LinkedIn as well. But again, highly recommend because I've been sharing a lot of those insights, lessons learned, even mistakes you can avoid. Make your own mistakes, don't copy mine. And use cases, customer cases, so you can come up with the right strategy and make decisions, informed decisions on how you can not just design and build, but also manage your existing SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Yeah, I can consider this the weekend. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again in the next episode.